That was Moshe Storch leading us in Hallel sometime last year when we used to get together to do a big musical Hallel. Right now we're in Sukkot. We say Hallel every day, but COVID. But still, this is the time of our rejoicing. We're in Chol HaMoed, the intermediate days of Sukkot. Let's do it with joy. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on this lovely Monday? Okay, Yehudit Sobel from Florence, South Carolina. Patrice from St. George. Diane says, good to see you. Nancy from Southern Pines. Stephen from Dover, New Hampshire. Randy from Florida. Juanita from Atlanta. Gwen from Michigan. John Shore from Sedona. Brandon from Knoxville. Tom from PA. Dahlia from Knoxville. Jay from Woodstock, Vermont. Michelle says, hi, Sal. Terry, hi, Michelle. Terry says is with us from Radcliffe, Kentucky. Leslie says, Moadim L'Simcha from Jersey. Deborah, bidding you peace from Canada. Paul saying shalom from Minneapolis. And Brenna says, missed last week to sit Shiva for my mother, Zichrono Livracha. It's nice to be back. Brenna, your mom's memory should always be for a blessing. And over on the YouTube side, Marassia with us from Atlanta. Marjorie says shalom, which we need. And Lynn from North Texas. All right, we got some work to do. We're going to have just a few more of those wisdom teachings that we opened yesterday. Hold on, let me get lined up here. What is going on here? Oh, yes, right here. That we opened yesterday. Yesterday on page... So where are we? We're on Daf Nun Hey. That's page 55. We're in chapter 5. We're learning the first Mishna in Tractate Eruvin, the third volume of the Talmud. Yesterday, on page 54 of Tractate Eruvin, we had a long series of wisdom teachings. Some of them were just so beautiful, spectacular. If you missed that class, you want to make it up. And what was really cool about it is that the sages who compiled the Talmud, right, so Ravina and Rav Ashi, when they, set out this long series of beautiful wisdom teachings, particularly about learning Torah, right, the difficulty, the challenges, how you can make your Torah learning stick, how you can learn it better, etc., how you can grow in wisdom through Torah. They opened that series of teachings with two teachings from the female sage, Beruria. She was Meir's wife, Rabbi Meir's wife, but she was a Torah scholar in her own right, and it's no coincidence that they opened that whole series of teachings with those from Beruria. So if you missed yesterday's class, you're going to want to make that up. Okay, so to finish that series... on the subject of, it takes effort. It simply takes effort to learn Torah, to learn it at a deep level. That obviously takes effort, but it takes extra effort to learn it in such a way that you retain it, right? So often we learn incredible things. We hear great teachings. We're inspired. Maybe we even share with somebody that we'd like them to hear it too. And then, a few days, weeks, months go by and I can't remember that thing at all. So how are we going to learn and keep it inside of us? That's what the subject has been. And yesterday we had a whole bunch of teachings about that. Beruria introduced that, and the main thing that she said about it is when you're learning, say it with your mouth so that your body is involved. It's not just running through your mind. I added to that I like to write things out by hand. That's how I prepare for these classes. What I'm going to teach, I write it out by hand, and then it gets into my body, and I understand it more clearly, and I retain more of it. More teachings about how to retain. So there's a verse in the Torah that was brought down yesterday, very famous saying of Moses himself, Moses our teacher, who said that this Torah, which God has given to me to give to you, right? God appeared before the whole Jewish people, so we know it was from God. It was a mass revelation at Mount Sinai. And then over some time, God's presence was always there, but he would give the teachings to Moses first. And for the written teachings, Moses wrote it down, and that became the Torah. And for the oral teachings, we discussed yesterday how the initial oral teachings, the core of the oral law, was transmitted by God to Moses, and then Moses to Aaron, and Moses to Aaron's sons, and Moses to the elders, and Moses to the people. And then Moses would leave the room, and then Aaron would repeat the teaching, and then he would leave the room, and then Aaron's sons would repeat the teaching. And there's that whole chain of transmission, how it came to us. So speaking about the Torah generally, both the written and oral Torah, Moses says, and he says this in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 12 and 13, he says, the Torah is not up in the heavens that people should say, who will go up to the heavens to retrieve it for us? And it is not across the sea that people should say, who will cross the sea to bring it back for us? Rather, it is very near to you, in your mouth and in your heart, to do it, right? To perform it. That's the verse in Deuteronomy. So about that verse, those two verses, Avdimi bar Chama bar Dosa says that the meaning of this verse, that it is not in heaven and nor is it beyond the sea, what this is actually teaching us is that if it were in heaven, we would be required to go up to heaven to get it and to learn it. And if the only way to learn it was to cross the sea, we would be required to cross the sea. Right, so it's not like we're off the hook because it's easier to learn. And if it was so difficult, if for some reason these great obstacles like having to go up to the heavens or having to cross a sea, if we had such obstacles to learn Torah, we would not be off the hook. We would still need to learn Torah. We would still be required to learn Torah. And so imagine what kind of effort would be required to learn the wisdom of the Lord if we had to somehow ascend into the heavens or cross a sea to get it. So that's the kind of effort that is required. Thank God it's not up in the heavens or across the sea. It's much nearer than that. But still, we have to be prepared to put that kind of effort into it. And that's how we're going to retain the Torah that we learn, according to Avdimi bar Chama bar Dosa. Rava says about this same verse, about the same idea that is not found in the heavens and is not across the sea. So Rav interprets this verse differently. He says that it is not up in the heavens. Okay, so this teaches that one who raises himself up over the Torah as if he is the heavens, right? If somebody treats himself like the heavens, meaning that he considers himself an authority on the Torah and he doesn't need other people to help him learn it, this person won't retain the Torah that he has learned. Nor if one considers himself like the sea, that he is the sea that's spread over the Torah, right? That he knows all of it, right? Everything that he's learned, he knows as much as he needs to see. He thinks he knows everything, all the different nuances about all the various matters that he's learned. Such a person will not retain his Torah. And that's very much in keeping with what we said yesterday. I forget whose teaching it was, but this idea, and I think that Rava said it in front of Rav Yosef, that who is going to retain his Torah is somebody who is humble like the wilderness, like the ground of the wilderness, right? He lets other people tread all over him in the sense that he wants to learn from everybody. We also have that teaching in Pirkei Avos, who is wise, says Ben Zoma, who is wise? One who learns from every person. So anybody who thinks that they can't learn from everybody, that's a haughty attitude, and that person will not retain his Torah. Likewise, Rabbi Yochanan says, similarly, that this idea that the Torah is not in heaven means that it is not found among the haughty, and that it is not across the sea means that somebody who is constantly traveling, perhaps a traveling merchant, or anybody who's so busy going and coming and going for his work that he doesn't set aside regular times to learn from the Torah, to learn Bible, to learn Talmud, to learn the tradition, he won't learn. right? So if you're so caught up in your work that you're coming and going all over the place as if you're all over the ocean, you won't learn and you won't retain what you learn. You must make regular times for Torah study. If you're involved in a daily study program like Daf Yomi with us here, you're doing great. That's fantastic. Okay. That completes that series of wisdom teachings that was initiated by what we learned from Beruria. And now we return to the subject of chapter 1 here in the first Mishna here in chapter 5 of Masechta of Tractate Eruvin. And so what we were learning about is we know that on Shabbos, a person can only travel 2,000 cubits from his dwelling. But if that dwelling is in a city, we've already learned, apologize. I did not set that on Do Not Disturb. Let me make sure I do not get disturbed. My apologies. Also over here. Yeah, I did that one. Okay, so where do we measure the 2,000 cubits from? From our dwelling. In fact, from the front door of our dwelling. But if our dwelling is in a city, then we get to walk anywhere within the city on Shabbos, and the Shabbos boundary, that measure of going 2,000 cubits in any direction, begins at the edges of the city. We also learned that for the purposes of measuring the Shabbos boundary, the city needs to have straight edges. And so in the Mishnah that opened this chapter, we were learning that if there's protrusions of the city, like turrets in the wall, and now we're going to add that if houses stick out of the city, so then we move the whole edge of the city to include those protrusions. So we're returning to this, and now we have a Tosefta. So a Tosefta, the Tosefta was compiled around the same time as the Mishnah. It is not considered as authoritative as the Mishnah, but it often includes some explanatory material that helps us understand the Mishnah better. All right, so we have a Tosefta that says if a city is long, meaning it's a rectangular shape, but it has straight edges, so we measure that city as is, even though it's a rectangle, like a long rectangle like this, we don't make it a square, right? Because we've talked about that the city should be shaped like a square because the Levite cities were shaped like squares, but we don't turn a rectangle into a square. We've already got straight edges, and that is good enough. If the city is round, then we do add corners. So that looks like this. Flip. Open. Here we go. So if the city is round, we're going to add... Where's my... Here we go. If the city is round, then we're going to add corners to it. And so even though there's not houses in those corners of the city, we're going to pretend that there are. And it's like you can walk anywhere within that square shape. That's all considered the city. And then when you leave the city, you get 2,000 cubits in any direction from those city edges that here now are forming a square. If it's a square. So if the city is shaped like a square, we don't add to it. Now, why does that need to be mentioned? I mean, we just said that if a city is a rectangle, we're not going to add to it and turn it into a square. If it's already a square, why would we adjust the shape at all? And the reason for that would be that you might have thought that if the square is sort of aligned off the axis of north and south, like if the square is, think of the diamond as the city, you might have thought that we would draw the boundaries around it so that there would be a north edge, a south edge, an east edge, and a west edge. But this Tosefta teaches us that we do not do that. We leave the city as it is, and we measure the 2,000 cubits. That's the limit of how far we can walk on Shabbos from the city edges as they are, even if that square is arranged sort of like a diamond with the corner in the north and another corner in the south. If it's arranged like, if the city is shaped like a trapezoid, okay, so in other words, it has a long edge and a short edge like this, then we would extend the short edge to turn it into a square. So you see that whenever we're adding to the city, what we're doing is creating a larger area where we're free to walk around on Shabbos. And we only measure the 2,000 cubit limit of how far we can go when we leave the city from this sort of, technical edge, not the actual edge of the city. So with the trapezoid, we expand it like that. If the city has protruding houses, right? And I think, is there a drawing for that? I think there was a drawing, right? So, yeah. So if we have like this, okay, so here we see a city, and you can see that there's that little house that's away from the city. As long as that's within 70 cubits of the city, we'll extend the whole edge of the city out to include it. And then you see that there's this like structure that is kind of a ruin, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But as long as it was built to be a residence at one time, then even though it has fallen apart and it's now a ruin and it doesn't even have a roof, but it was a residential structure, so it still counts. And as long as that's within 70 cubits of the city, we'll extend the whole edge of the city to include that ruin. And then we start counting the 2,000 cubits that we can walk on Shabbos from that edge that that now encompasses even that ruin that's on the outskirts of the city. If a city is shaped like a bow and arrow, okay, so then we have this structure like this. So the city shape is like this shape, this bow. So then that inset area, it's almost like a half a donut, right? And where people don't live and there's no houses in that inset area. So we draw as if it's like a bow string, like the string of a bow and arrow across the sort of flat edge from one end to the other. And we consider as if there's houses in that whole empty area. And we would start measuring the 2,000 cubits that we can walk from that line, that imaginary line that connects the two ends of the bow. However, if the two ends of the bow are more than 4,000 cubits apart, so like this one, then you see, if you think about it, when you leave one end of the city, 4,000 cubits would mean that you get 2,000 cubits from there and 2,000 cubits from the other end, and then you meet in the middle and you could draw that bowstring. But if it's a really large city that bows around like that, and the two ends of the bow are more than the 4,000 cubits apart, then you cannot draw that string, as it were, that imaginary border, and measure from there. Rather, you would measure the city as is. So that's how we draw the edges of a city when they're irregularly shaped cities. And most cities are irregularly shaped in one way or another, particularly that they don't have straight edges at the edge of the city. So this idea of expanding the whole city to include the outer lying houses, I mean, when you think about modern cities and suburbs, I don't know. I don't know how far you're going to expand that sort of metropolitan area. But that's above my pay grade today. We're not going to talk about how far modern cities go. Okay. We talked about that. Okay, and ruins, you need just 3 walls, right? So if a ruin has 3 walls standing, it doesn't even have to have the 4th wall, but it has to have 3 walls, even without a roof. As long as it was residential at one time, then we're going to expand the city for that. But if it was not residential, if it was like the ruin of a factory or the ruin of some kind of a memorial for the dead, That is not going to expand the city. And so, in fact, now we get a list of the kinds of buildings that are considered residential and for which we expand the city, and then a list of buildings for which we don't consider that they expand the city limit. So let's see. Come in here, a proof from a Tosefta. These are the structures that are included in the city's extension. A monument over a grave that is 4 cubits by 4 cubits. Now, there's going to be some disagreement about that. This monument over the grave, it may only work if it's sort of big enough that it has a guard who also lives there, and that's what makes it residential. Our sages will actually talk about a monument over a grave. They're going to say that when a righteous person dies, it is not correct to build a big memorial over their grave. Rather, when a righteous person dies, the way that we remember them is through their words, right? And that kind of makes sense because memorials are nice, but how much do memorials really enter our daily lives? But somebody who taught wisdom, somebody whose actions were righteous and that we remember them and we remember their words, what they said and how they approached situations, and then those words get passed down through the generations, that is a truly fitting memorial. A bridge or a grave in which there is a residence, a synagogue in which there is a residence for the gabbai, right? So a house of prayer does not extend the city because it's not residential. But if the rabbi's assistant actually lives in the building, then it's residential and then it extends the city. Interesting, an idolatrous temple will extend the city if the priests of that idolatrous religion live there, right? It doesn't matter what they do in that building. The question is it residential? So even an idolatrous temple, an idolatrous temple, as long as it has a residence for its priests, will extend the city. And similarly, horse stables and storehouses in the fields in which there is a residence, and small watchtowers in the fields. And similarly, a house on an island in the sea or a lake which is located within 70 cubits of the city. All of these structures are included in a city's boundaries. And these structures are not included in the boundaries of a city. A tomb that was breached on both sides. Okay, so it seems like a tomb counts, even without a residence. I guess the concept is it's a residence for the one who's buried there. But if it was breached on both sides from here to there, i.e. from one side all the way to the other side, then it's not going to count. And similarly, a bridge and a grave that do not have a residence, and a synagogue that does not have a residence for the sexton or the gabbai, and an idolatrous temple that does not have a residence for the priests, and similarly, stables and storehouses and fields that do not have a residence and therefore not used for human habitation, and a cistern where water is gathered, and an elongated water ditch, and a cave, i.e. a covered cistern, and a wall and a dovecote in the field, and similarly a house on a boat that is not permanently located within 70 cubits of the city. All these structures are not included in the city limits. So the principle is pretty straightforward. If it's residential and it's within 70 cubits of what we might have thought was the city edge, the whole city edge gets extended to include that structure. Okay, now we're taught. So now that we heard that a house on a boat, right, because it's not permanent, is not going to extend the city. Although I just saw, where did I see it? I saw it in the newspaper. They did there was some kind of like a real estate profile about somebody who had taken like a riverboat and then, put it in land and actually built land around it. And it was, like made it and put it on a foundation and it became a house, right? So that might have been a boat at one time, but it's certainly a permanent residence and a house, and that would extend the city. Okay, so, but temporary structures do not extend the city. So then we learned that a group of huts, right, even if it's a group of huts, is not going to be considered a city, even if they're there all the time. And there may be some exception to that if somehow it really has become permanent in some way. And certainly if there are a couple of permanent structures among them, namely, if there's, I think if there's 3 courtyards that have 2 houses each, then for sure, whether there's temporary huts around that or not, that's going to be considered a city, right? The minimum amount of space, the minimum number of structures to be considered a city is 3 courtyards that have 2 houses each. That would be a city. For the purposes of that, then you draw lines around it, and all those people would measure their Shabbos boundary, how far they can walk on Shabbos from the edges of that grouping, that settlement. But if they're all just living in huts, then each person is going to measure his 2,000 cubits that he can walk on Shabbos from the entrance of his hut. Now, this is a little interesting, so the Gemara is going to bring an objection to this, and it's going to say, well, wait a minute. When the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness and living in huts known as sukkahs, right? What we're living in right now during the holiday of Sukkot, another one of these nice coincidences. I mean, it is a coincidence, right? We're in a 7.5-year journey. It could have come out at any time that we're studying this page, but Eruvin is not about sukkahs, but we're talking about sukkahs. And we're living in our sukkahs because we're in the festival of Sukkot. So, when all the children of Israel were living in sukkahs in the wilderness during those 40 years, we're told that people who needed to go to the bathroom, right? If you needed to go to the bathroom, you would leave the whole encampment. Now, there were 2 million people there. So to leave the encampment so that you wouldn't do your business within the encampment. Why? Because the children of Israel considered holy, and this is a holy place. The presence of the Lord was actually in among them, right? That pillar of cloud, a manifestation of God's presence over the tent of meeting, over the tabernacle in the midst of them, meant that if you needed to go to the bathroom, you couldn't do it within the encampment. You had to leave the encampment. And there's 2 million people there. So for sure, if you're leaving that encampment, you're walking more than 2,000 cubits to get there. Right? It's a long way to go to the bathroom. You really have to think about when you're going to go and to, do your business. Excuse me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shak, kol nehim baruch. So, since you're able to walk more than 2,000 cubits to leave the encampment in order to go to the bathroom, it must mean that the encampment is considered a city, and that you can walk anywhere throughout the city on Shabbos, but only once you reach the edge of the city, now you have a limit of 2,000 cubits from the edge of the city. But we just said that if people are living in temporary huts, and particularly in the desert, it said that people who live in huts in the desert, that is not considered a city. So which is it? Was it a city or was it not a city? So Rava answers, that was different. If the Lord tells you directly to go live in a bunch of huts in the desert, then it's a city. Then it's a city. Then your encampment is a city. But if you're not there at the direct order of the Lord, then you're just a group of huts. Okay, then each of you gets a boundary 2,000 cubits from the entrance of your hut or your tent. Okay. And who was it that said, hold on. It was Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav. He said that those who dwell in huts year round and desert travelers, their lives are not lives, right? He's saying that this is not a way to live. It's too difficult. Of course, there are people who live that way, and, that's their traditional way to live. But it's just too difficult to live that way. So, if they want to live that way, it's okay for them to live that way. But Rav Yehuda, in the name of Rav, is recommending that you don't live that way. Why? Because if you live in the desert, sort of, as a nomad, right, in these temporary structures, maybe you stay in one place for a long time, maybe forever, but they're really temporary structures that could, blow away in a stiff wind. And in this encampment, for you to go and do your thing, to do your business, you have to leave and be out of sight of the encampment. You don't have plumbing, you don't have indoor plumbing, you don't have permanent structures to go to the bathroom, to bathe, to do the things that you need to do, for the women to immerse in a mikveh once a month. And so to do those things, you have to wander so far away from the encampment that it's just not safe. You can't take care of your family under those conditions. So of course people manage to live that way, but Rav Yehuda, in the name of Rav, does not recommend it. And so when he says their lives are not lives, he's just saying, it's just too difficult to live that way, not recommended. Okay, and that's what I've got for us today. Nina is very busy preparing dinner. We're having some guests in our outdoor space, in our sukkah. We're actually going to be able to take the walls down so it really is outdoors, and tables apart so we can socially distance. So that means I need to scan the comments because she can't pass them to me. Let me see. Pam Simmons says, a little confused. With a city that is shaped like a bow, why wouldn't the city limits be extended to have the shape of a rectangle or a square? It's an excellent question because we saw with a round city we do. Now, you know what? Maybe we do on the outer corners extend that way. But really what we're talking about is in this sort of half donut shape, what are we going to do with the center, right? The center is what we're dealing with in this situation, and whether we consider it as if the center of that half donut is considered inhabited or not, and if the two ends are closer to each other than 4,000 cubits, then it's considered, yes, it's closed off. But if they're further apart than that, they're not. They do show in one of the figures that if it's more of a, they call it like the Greek letter gamma. I'm surprised they didn't say a daled, like this, right? So if this, you could think of this as a bow, but it's maybe a little bit more like, I don't know, a chevron. Is that the name of that figure? Right? So if it's more like that kind of an L shape, so then you would square it off. Now you're not just extending a straight line from that corner to corner. Now you're squaring it off. So that's how we do that kind of situation. Let me see if I can scan for other questions. A modern equivalent of those huts would be trailer parks. That's a good question, Lucy. I don't know that much about trailer parks, but I'm thinking no. I think trailer parks would be considered permanent. Right? Don't a lot of trailer parks it's clear that they're fixed there. They even have little gardens, and they're hooked up to power. And it's not like mobile homes that just drive off, right? A lot of them, it would take some doing to pick it up and move it. So I think that would be a question you'd need to ask the rabbi, right? It's not so simple. Is that considered a temporary structure or not, enough for it to count as sort of a little town, as it were? Okay, that seems to be all the questions over there. And over on the YouTube side, no questions either. Okay, so may you all have a really sweet Chol HaMoed, these intermediate days of Sukkot. Remember, this is a very universal holiday. In ancient Israel, when the temple stood, sacrifices were brought on behalf of all the nations of the world. This is the time of our rejoicing when we all, the human family, can look forward to the messianic times when we will, God's presence will be revealed to all, and we will all be the children of God together. And this is a little bit of a taste of that time to come. May it be sweet for you and all your loved ones.